So, what's on your plate today? Seriously, take a second. Think about it. Could that simple choice, that meal you just had, or maybe you're planning for later, could it actually ripple outwards, impacting more than just like your energy levels or your own health, but reaching out and affecting the whole planet?
It sounds pretty big, I know.
Yep.
But the sources we're digging into for this deep dive, they argue exactly that, those connections. They're not just surprising, they're critical, they're woven together in ways that, honestly, most of us probably don't think about day to day.
And that's exactly what we're getting into today. We're exploring these, well, profound, sometimes challenging, but really crucial links between your daily food habits, your own health, and, yeah, the health and sustainability of the Earth itself.
Yeah, and our sources for this exploration, there are a series of articles from Strength by Fitness. They've gathered quite a bit of data, insights from nutrition science, environmental research, public health studies, and they present it as sort of a fact-based reality, not tied to specific politics or cultural viewpoints.
All right, so our mission here for this deep dive is really to cut through the noise. We want to unpack these sources piece by piece, pull out the most important facts, the key insights. The goal is really to help you understand why what you eat matters, on so many different levels. And it's all based on the data presented in these articles.
Okay, so let's kick things off where the sources do, which is establishing how directly the planet's health really impacts our health, human health.
Yeah.
And they don't pull any punches here.
No, they really don't.
Yeah.
They use this incredibly vivid and honestly pretty dreadful example. It's from a documentary about Indonesia, and it just paints this picture. Overflowing toxic landfills, garbage literally being shoved into the ocean. And then, this is the really disturbing part, that waste is actually fueling local food production.
It's a stark image, isn't it? Environmental breakdown. And the articles tie it directly to some horrifying consequences. We're talking polluted air, contaminated soil, tainted water, and all of that directly impacts the food people are trying to grow, trying to eat in those areas.
And the human cost is just immense, according to these sources anyway. They cite data showing millions dying prematurely every single year, just from air pollution globally. And beyond that, billions more suffering worldwide from decades of poor health, chronic diseases, all linked back to this kind of environmental contamination. And the articles are clear. This isn't just one place. They mention Indonesia, India, the US. It's happening everywhere. No country is really immune, they say.
And this kind of environmental mess leads to a really basic fundamental problem, right? When people have no choice but to drink tap water that's laced with waste, maybe plastics, or eat food grown in toxic soil or fueled by toxic stuff, maybe picking berries near landfills, or eating fish that are full of lead, heavy metals, microplastics.
It just becomes impossible, doesn't it? For them to live a genuinely healthy life, eat healthy food, doesn't matter what else they do.
Exactly. That's the core point the sources hammer home. If the planet keeps heading down this path, becoming this, unsustainable waste dump on an even bigger scale, well, getting healthy food, staying healthy yourself,
Yeah.
it just becomes impossible for most people. It ties our own well-being directly, inextricably to the planet's health.
Wow. Okay, that really puts it starkly right from the start. So with our health so clearly tied to the planet's health, the sources then introduce this key idea, a way to measure the connection. They talk about comparing the actual edible nutrition we get from food relative to the environmental harm, the pollution caused by producing it.
Yeah, this presented as a really core metric, a way to look at both human health outcomes and planetary well-being together. And the articles focus mostly on omnivore habits because, well, that's how most people eat globally.
And they show this pretty consistent correlation, right?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, the less plant-based food you eat if you're an omnivore, the less nutrition you tend to get for each unit of planetary impact. It's just less efficient for you and for the Earth.
And what's really fascinating, or maybe alarming, is the scale of the difference the data shows. When you compare different food production methods, like a strict carnivore approach, according to these sources, it has this huge negative impact on the planet. They list it all out. Land pollution, fossil fuel use, air and water pollution, massive land use bumping out nature, fresh water use, nutrient depletion, deforestation, wildlife impacts, even crop death. And despite this massive environmental cost, the actual nutrient yield, what humans get out of it per unit of impact, is significantly lower.
But an omnivore diet that includes more plants, that gets, as they put it, more bang for the buck. So substantially better nutrition for the amount of planetary impact involved.
They give some specific numbers that are, well, pretty eye-opening. Take land use per gram of protein. Beef needs about 20 times more land than nuts. And get this, 35 times more land than grains, just for the same amount of protein. Or look at calories. To get 1,000 calories, beef cattle need around 120 square meters of land. Peas. They only need about 2.16 square meters for the same calories.
That's enormous.
Yeah.
Over 50 times the land for beef compared to peas, calorie for calorie. And it's not just land, is it?
Nope, not at all. Look at milk. A single liter of cow's milk needs over 600 liters of fresh water and about 9 square meters of land. Now compare that to soy milk, less than 30 liters of water and only 0.66 square meters of land per liter. The footprint is just vastly different.
And what about greenhouse gas emissions?
Also a huge difference, cow's milk production. Around 3 kilograms of greenhouse gases per liter. That's triple the emissions of soy milk, which is usually under 1 kilogram per liter.
Okay, this is maybe one of the most interesting points from the sources. They highlight that the difference in emissions between foods, like, say, beef and peas, is so massive that how far the food travels, the food miles, becomes kind of minor in comparison. Like producing a kilogram of beef, about 60 kilograms of greenhouse gases. Peas, around 1 kilogram per kilogram.
Exactly. So even if you have local beef versus peas shipped from further away, the production emissions from the beef are likely still way, way higher, orders of magnitude higher. It really shifts where the focus should be, doesn't it? Not just local, but what you're eating.
It really does. And that kind of leads into this powerful argument the sources make. This idea that what's good for the planet is actually equally good for your own health. Like a symbiosis.
Yeah, that's the core argument they build. The more plant-based nutrients you take in, generally, the better your nutritional intake, which leads to better health outcomes for you personally.
And the sources are careful, right? They're not saying everyone must go 100% plant-based.
No, they're very clear on that. It's not about a mandate, but they are presenting the outcomes based on the data they've compiled. And that data shows more plant-based foods often mean, quite directly, more human nutrients, less pollution, a healthier planet. And yeah, better personal health.
They do acknowledge plant-based isn't perfect either, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. But when you compare the environmental footprints, the sources frame the plant-based path as just drastically better, nutrient for nutrient. They argue that the current global scale of animal-heavy food production is, well, mathematically impossible to sustain if we want to stay within our planet's ecological boundaries.
And they pinpoint what they call the real issue with animal agriculture. It's not always that the animal foods themselves aren't nutritious. They can be, especially if you eat lots of plants too. But it's the, quote, impossibly bad planetary impact of producing them at the scale we do. An impact, they argue, just can't be offset by the nutritional benefits alone.
Okay, but this brings up the big but, doesn't it? The question people always ask when you talk about sustainability and food, protein, people worry, isn't animal protein just better? Or they point to, like, bodybuilders eating loads of meat. What do the sources say?
Yeah, they tackle that head on.
Yeah.
They point out, first off, that plenty of high-level athletes, including bodybuilders, thrive without eating meat at all. And while, okay, maybe some individual animal foods score slightly higher on certain protein synthesis metrics if you look at them in isolation.
But nobody eats just one food in isolation, right?
Exactly. The sources argue that when you combine protein from different plant sources in your meals, think beans and rice, lentils and quinoa, whatever, the actual outcome for building muscle, for protein synthesis, for amino acid levels in real life, for athletes or just regular folks training, it's presented as being just as effective as getting protein from animal sources.
Yeah, they really emphasize that. Strength gains, building muscle, performing well athletically. It can all progress just as well with a well-planned, plant-focused diet. And often the overall health markers are actually better. It kind of challenges that old idea that meat is somehow essential for getting strong.
So based on the data they looked at, the sources give some specific protein guidelines, right?
Yeah.
Grams per kilogram of body weight per day.
They do. For regular exercising omnivores, say age 20 to 40, the typical range is about 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilogram daily.
Okay. And why is it recommended to go a bit higher, maybe over 2.0 grams per kilogram for people eating mostly plants or doing low-carb training?
Good question. The sources suggest a couple of reasons. Partly, if you're low carb, your body might use a bit more protein for energy. But also, some plant proteins might have slightly lower absorption or bioavailability, or maybe not quite as complete an amino acid profile individually. So aiming a bit higher just ensures you're definitely covering all your bases for muscle building and repair.
Makes sense. And then for people over 40, they suggest adding another 0.4 grams per kilogram or so, no matter the diet type.
Correct. The reasoning there is that as we age, nutrient absorption can become a bit less efficient. Building muscle might get slightly tougher, maybe storing fat gets a bit easier. So keeping protein intake robust, along with getting enough fiber and micronutrients, is highlighted as really key for maintaining muscle and function as you get older. And they do note exceeding these minimums can still be beneficial too.
Right, okay. Now, shifting gears just a little. The sources introduce this concept they call higher-SPC. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, SPC stands for satiety per calorie. So
Mhm.
higher SPC foods are basically those that give you more stuff, more protein, fiber, vitamins, minerals, relative to the amount of energy, the calories they contain. Think nutrient density, but also how filling it is. More nutritional bang for your calorie buck, essentially.
And the opposite then, lower SPC foods have more calories but fewer nutrients.
Exactly. And the sources link these lower SPC foods directly to what seems like a paradox, right? They can potentially cause both obesity and nutritional deficiency at the same time.
Whoa, okay. Obesity and deficiency together. How does that even work?
The sources explain it as a kind of universal truth about food quality. A lot of people, and this includes many who are obese, but also billions more, are eating too much food that's high in energy, but just nutritionally poor. It lacks variety, lacks completeness. Often if highly processed stuff, maybe designed more for profit and getting you to eat more rather than for health.
So you're getting the calories, maybe too many calories, but missing out on the really essential vitamins and minerals your body needs.
Precisely. And the articles share some truly staggering data on this. Global micronutrient deficiencies. From a big study looking at 15 nutrients across loads of countries, we are talking billions of people. Iodine deficiency affects maybe 5 billion people. That's like 68% of everyone on Earth. Vitamin E, 5 billion. Calcium, 5 billion. Iron, 4.9 billion. Even the nutrient with the lowest measured deficit, niacin, still impacts something like 1.7 billion people.
Wow. Almost 2 billion people lacking even the least deficient nutrient they measured. What about some others?
Thiamine deficiency, 2.2 billion. Magnesium, 2.4 billion.
Yeah.
And vitamin C, over 4 billion people aren't getting enough. They use the example of scurvy, the classic vitamin C deficiency disease, just to drive home that these aren't minor issues. These deficiencies have real serious health consequences, cognitive problems, growth issues, weak immune systems, fatigue, alongside the classic diseases.
That data also really seems to argue against relying on just one superfood, right? Like saying, oh, I'll just eat eggs for everything.
Yeah, the sources touch on that too. Sure, eggs are nutritious, no doubt. But they have zero vitamin C, for example. You just can't get the whole range of essential micronutrients you need for long-term health from one or even just a few foods. You need variety.
So how do you actually achieve that nutritional completeness? And also improve satiety, that feeling of fullness, which helps manage how much you eat overall.
The sources really emphasize the power of combining high-protein foods with whole plant-based foods. That combination is naturally high satiety. You get the protein, sure, but you also get loads of fiber, high food volume, water content from the plants, and all those essential micronutrients we were just talking about.
And that high satiety just makes it easier to eat within your energy needs naturally.
Yeah, it helps manage your appetite. Often leads to naturally eating less overall, while at the same time improving your health, your physical capacity, and your nutrient intake. It's a win-win-win. They do mention for the small number of people who might actually struggle to eat enough this way, you can add in some energy-dense, nutrient-dense foods strategically. Like unsweetened peanut butter is an example they give, though they note it's actually relatively lower SPC compared to its high energy content, unlike, say, lentils.
Okay, so the big takeaway here seems to be getting enough protein is important, yes, and doable in different ways.
Yeah.
But getting that wide array of micronutrients from a real variety of whole foods every day, that's absolutely critical for long-term health.
Precisely. The sources make a very strong case for that, especially looking at that global deficiency data.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together now. Pulling from the environmental stuff, the nutritional findings, what's the direct comparison the sources end up drawing between plant-based and animal-based approaches, looking at both sides of the coin?
Well, they talk about this one significant study that specifically compared meat and dairy alternatives, looked at them across nutrition, health impacts, environment, even cost. And the findings, they say, were pretty clear-cut.
And the main finding was that swapping out meat or dairy calories for plant-based ones significantly cut the environmental impact.
Yes, very significantly, up to something like a 40% reduction in environmental impact when replacing meat calories, and up to 16% reduction when replacing dairy calories with plant-based options.
And did this environmental win come at a nutritional cost? Did this study or sources suggest you lose out on protein or completeness?
Not if you do it right. That's the key caveat the sources emphasize. This environmental benefit can be achieved without sacrificing nutrition, protein, or satiety, provided you're choosing the right things: nutritionally rich, high protein, higher SPC plant-based foods.
Okay, so which specific unprocessed plant foods came out on top in that study as good meat replacements, considering both environment and health?
The study cited in the sources really highlighted soybeans, peas, and beans. They scored incredibly well, like 93 to 97 out of 100 on the study's combined scale. Soybeans were noted as particularly good for nutrition and cost effectiveness. Peas scored best for mortality outcomes and having the lowest greenhouse gas emissions.
Which again just reinforces that idea of variety, right? Don't just eat soy. Combine soy, peas, lentils, maybe some nuts and seeds, maybe some plant-based protein products. Get that wider range.
Exactly. Now, here's where the sources add an interesting layer, a bit of nuance, when they discuss plant-based milks in relation to the study. The study found that environmentally, oat milk and almond milk did quite well.
Right, but the sources we're discussing, they seem to disagree a bit with the study's take that oat and almond milk are nutritionally on par with soy milk or even cow's milk.
Yes, exactly. They offer a bit of critical analysis here. They argue that while oat and almond milk are definitely better for the environment than dairy, their nutritional profiles often don't stack up. Specifically, almond meat has way less protein, less potassium, magnesium, fiber, carbs compared to soy milk, and oat milk generally has even less protein and lower overall nutritional density than soy.
So while they might be good choices environmentally compared to dairy, they aren't necessarily the best nutritional choice among plant milks.
That's the point the sources are making. They paraphrase findings from another study cited, which basically said most plant drinks have significantly less protein than cow's milk, and processing can sometimes slightly reduce amino acid quality. So because of this, the sources generally recommend enhanced soy milk as often the best all-around plant-based milk choice. Why? Because it's the closest to cow's milk levels for both nutrients and protein, and the difference is small enough they argue it's insignificant in real life. They kind of position oat and almond milk as maybe good alternatives to water, or useful if you get your protein and nutrients elsewhere. But if you want your plant milk to really contribute significantly to your nutrition, soy is often the superior choice, according to these sources.
That's a really useful distinction to make. Okay, so taking all this data, the environmental impacts, the nutrition, the specific food comparisons, how does this all add up on a global scale, according to these articles?
They circle back to those global food production numbers. They state that right now, only about 18% of the calories people eat globally, and maybe 37% of the protein, comes from livestock. Yet, producing just that amount requires this massive, totally disproportionate share of the world's resources, land, water, and generates huge emissions, like we talked about. This is what they frame as the fundamental mathematics that make a global food system heavily reliant on animal agriculture seem unsustainable in the long run.
So based on everything we've discussed, what's the sort of bottom line conclusion the sources draw for someone eating plant-based and for an omnivore?
Okay, so for someone who chooses to be completely plant-based, the sources conclude that a diet focused on nutritionally rich, high-protein, higher SPC whole plant foods, that's presented as the best overall approach if you want to combine personal health and fitness goals with planetary well-being, primarily because its environmental impact is just so much lower than animal-heavy diets.
Right. And what about for omnivores?
For omnivores, it's interesting. They say if you were to completely ignore the planet side of things, just ignore it, and focus only on your own health, fitness, body composition. The sources state there's practically zero difference in those outcomes between a high-protein omnivore diet that also includes tons of whole plant foods and a well-planned, high-protein, completely plant-based diet. The results are basically the same. Therefore, when you factor the environmental data back in, the second best thing for omnivores, according to these sources, is that mix, strategically including some animal protein they specifically mention, fish, eggs, chicken, alongside a really significant amount of diverse whole plant-based foods.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the main takeaways from this deep dive then. First, your food choices. They have these really profound, undeniable impacts, not just on you, but on the planet's health too. Second, the data shows this shocking global issue. Billions suffering from nutritional deficiencies, often right alongside over-consuming calories.
Exactly. And third, focusing on high-protein, nutrient-dense, those higher SPC foods that's presented as key. Key for your health, for feeling full, for managing calories better, whatever your diet type. Fourth, Increasing your intake of plant-based foods significantly lowers your environmental footprint per nutrient you consume.
Yeah. And fifth, the sources argue you can get comparable, sometimes even better, health outcomes by doing that,
Okay.
especially if you pick nutrient-rich plants and combine them well. And finally, it's really important to look critically at nutritional info, like really dig into the actual nutrient content of different foods and alternatives. Don't just rely on headlines or only environmental scores.
Absolutely. And the sources really stress these are presented as fact-based realities from the data, not just, opinions or politics or traditions.
Which kind of leaves us with this final thought to chew on, doesn't it? Building on that emphasis on reality and the data we've just gone through, given the truly staggering scale of global nutritional deficiencies, billions affected, combined with what the sources present as the unsustainable math of resource use for animal agriculture at its current scale, how might traditional food cultures, maybe even our own deeply ingrained personal preferences about food, how might they need to adapt globally in the coming years, to meet both the health needs of everyone on the planet and stay within the Earth's finite limits? Something to think about.